Statement brings back to me a favourite saying of the late Alan Hardacre. Why is it that players who act dishonestly on the field become scrupulously honest immediately the game is over? Well, that's it for this afternoon, except to remind you that you'll be able to see highlights of that FA Cup semi-final replay between Tottenham Hotspur and Wolverhampton Wanderers on Wednesday at 9:55. 9:55 rather, and that cup football is backed by snooker and amateur boxing. That's a sporting feast on Sports Night next Wednesday, 9:55. Finally, our commiserations to Ipswich and our congratulations to Manchester City, and particularly their captain Paul Power, whose trusty left foot has never been put to better use. Good evening.
Power. Oh, I say, what a goal!
In 10 minutes, the Antiques Roadshow meets the people of Salisbury to evaluate some of their most treasured possessions. Now, at a little after 5:50 on BBC1, the news with Richard Baker.
The Home Secretary in Brixton at the scene of last night's rioting. Now trouble has flared again.
5, 4, we've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start.
America's space shuttle lifts off on its historic mission, but there's a minor problem with the heat shield. After last night's rioting in Brixton, there's now been new trouble in the past hour. Again, it involved predominantly black youths and the police. During the day, Brixton had been calm, with time for clearing up and for questions. How and why did it happen? What happened is clear enough. Violence engulfed many streets in the centre of Brixton. 165 policemen were injured, many seriously. Scores of shops, pubs and cars were burnt out. The Home Secretary, Mr. Whitelaw's reaction, distress and horror. And this afternoon, he went to Brixton to see for himself. Gavin Hewitt was there last night and again today.
There is official bewilderment as to how a riot on this scale occurred. For nearly 6 hours last night, police struggled to retain control of Brixton's decaying streets. Their antagonists were 500 or 600 mainly black teenagers, whose fury, it appears, was aimed primarily at the police, but in the end was vented on the buildings of their own community. There was this morning a strange silence as residents tried to comprehend what had happened. Only last night the Windsor Castle had been serving drinks. Now it's completely devastated, as if it had been blown away by a bomb. A street away, the George pub is gutted. Nearby, a store selling bathroom equipment is wrecked. The streets are littered with the frames of over 30 cars which were set alight. In Brixton's main shopping area, over 150 shops were damaged. Many shop owners found their premises looted. I had seen during the night police watching the looting, but under orders not to intervene and thereby provoke more trouble. What has caused concern is how a routine police inquiry was interpreted as police repression, and the speed with which Molotov cocktails were prepared and thrown at police. It has led senior officers to suggest that the trouble had been planned by outside agitators, an analysis bitterly rejected by community leaders.
There is no evidence that we can find, either yesterday or today, to suggest that outsiders came into Brixton to stir up trouble or to take part in the events of the last 24 hours. All the evidence that we have found suggests that this was spontaneous rising of Brixton's community against the police and as an expression against injustice and a lack of voice, may we stress, in the institutions of government, in Parliament, in the Borough Council, and in areas which make decisions which affect the quality of life of black people in Brixton and other areas.
Tensions had not evaporated when the Home Secretary, Mr. Whitelaw, visited Brixton this afternoon. As he toured the damaged streets, there were chants of derision, and Mr. Whitelaw was closely protected by police. He now faces demands by community leaders for an independent inquiry into police action. But the Home Secretary stressed the importance of supporting the police.
I have seen enough damage to convince me that a serious breakdown of law and order occurred. I've also seen enough to convince me that the police have, in their very difficult task, and I want to say this again, again, and again, deserve the support of every law-abiding citizen in this country, because this country places on all its citizens that responsibility, because we ask the police to carry out these duties on our behalf.
But certainly, there has been a lot of damage, a lot of looting, and I want to say this to the responsible people of Brixton, that we will continue to police Brixton and uphold and enforce the law. Of that, the decent, responsible people needn't be in any doubt.
But there are fears that the ruins of Brixton are a symbol of the wider despair felt by many young blacks in Britain.
And now to today's other big story, the launch of the shuttle. At 1 o'clock this afternoon, a new era in space exploration was heralded by the blast-off at Cape Canaveral in Florida. It all went successfully, too, even though in the hours since takeoff, the two astronauts have discovered that some of the thousands of heat-resistant tiles that coat the ship have come off. Otherwise, it's going almost entirely according to plan. Columbia is scheduled to complete 36 orbits of the Earth before returning home on Tuesday evening. This report from our correspondent, Martin Bell.
Early morning on pad 39A. Take 2 for the launch of the Columbia, for the pilot, Bob Crippen, and for the commander, John Young. From the breakfast to the suiting up to the later pre-flight routines, everything was just as it had been 48 hours before, but this time even more encouragement from their colleagues at Cape Canaveral. And another difference. This time the computers on the Columbia were on speaking terms with each other. And so to the final moments of the countdown, and the voice was the voice of launch control.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
And here was the turn as the spaceship Columbia, now on her back, marched out over the Atlantic. Two minutes after liftoff, and according to plan, the solid rocket boosters broke away in 2 balls of fire. A little over an hour later, the first pictures of the shuttle in space were received, the view from the payload door.
We do have a few tiles missing off of both of them. Off of the starboard pod, it's got basically what appears to be 3 tile and some smaller pieces.
These are not critical tiles. These tiles that are missing represent no hazard to the vehicle or the crew. The worst that can happen is that after landing, a small patch of skin underneath the tiles may have to be replaced.
And on the ground, where the problems with the tiles were not yet known, the mood was jubilation.
Prince Charles has arrived in Canberra from New Zealand on the next stage of his tour. He'll be in Australia for 2 weeks. The Prince was met by the Governor-General, Sir Zelman Cowen, and Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, and another enthusiastic crowd. The Prince's arrival has renewed keen speculation in the Australian capital that he'll be the next Governor-General. Prince Charles went to school in Australia, and Lady Diana Spencer's family has strong Australian connections. Maxim Shostakovich, son of one of the Soviet Union's greatest composers, Dmitri Shostakovich, has defected to the West. He'd been conducting a concert in Bavaria. In the final test, England have taken another wicket. West Indies are now 58 behind. And that's the news early this evening. We'll be back again on BBC1 at 8:45. The weatherman today is John Sherwood.
Good evening. Well, most of us have had some rain over the weekend with a series of lows moving north across the country. This last one's filling quickly now, still giving a little rain in some places, But we have to watch the high because this will be moving towards northern Scotland by this time tomorrow, bringing much finer weather over the next couple of days to most places. But let's look at tonight's chart first, and still some of that rain lingering around in southern Scotland, northern England. That clearing during the night, though, and then joining with the rest of Scotland and Northern Ireland in a fairly clear and a fairly cold night. A frost in many places and quite a sharp frost in some of those Scottish glens, I think. It'll stay mostly cloudy, though, in southern parts of England and Wales, and just about dry everywhere. And then tomorrow it's going to be a fairly cloudy start in many of these southern regions, but I think we will find it brightening up as the day goes on, during the morning in many southern and western parts. And I think during the afternoon we might even see some sunshine coming along to some of the more central and southern parts. Staying cloudy near the east coast, though, and quite cold, 8 centigrades, only 46, and a stiff easterly breeze to go with it. In the north and west, though, lots of sunshine right from the word go, so becoming fairly warm, 13, 55, a bit warmer than today. And over the next day or two, mostly fine and settled. That's all from me. Good evening.
On BBC1 tonight, the world television premiere of Arthur Miller's classic play, The Crucible, set in the oppressive atmosphere of Puritan Massachusetts in 1692.
Ad infernus! Abigail, what sort of dancing were you doing with her in the forest?
Why, common dancing is all.
I think I ought to say that I saw a kettle in the grass where they were dancing.
That were only soup.
What sort of soup were in that kettle, Abigail?
Why, it were beans and lentils, I think.
Miss Harris, you did not notice, did you, any living thing in the soup? A spider, a frog, a mouse.
I do believe there were some movement in the soup.
That jumped in, we never put it in.
What jumped in?
Why, a very little frog jumped.
Frog? Abigail, it may well be that your cousin is dying. Did you call the devil last night?
I never called him. Tituba, Tituba.
She called the devil. Who comes to you with the devil? 2, 3, 4? How many?
There was 4. There was 4.
Oh, their names, their names.
Oh, how many times did make me kill you, Mr. Barry?
Kill me?
I might go over myself. I go back to Jesus. I kiss his hand. I saw Sarah Good with the devil. I saw Bridget Bishop with the devil. I saw George Jagers with the devil. I saw Goody Howe with the devil.
She speaks. You ordered to go.
The hysteria of the Salem witch hunt, introducing Sarah Berger as Abigail, with Eric Porter, Daniel Massey and Michael N. Harbour in the cast of The Crucible, on BBC1 tonight at 7:15.
Now on BBC1 Antiques Roadshow, stopping off this week in Salisbury.
Hello, glad you could join us again for the programme this week, which comes to you from Salisbury in Wiltshire, a city that has at its heart one of this country's most beautiful buildings, Salisbury Cathedral, with that elegant spire which reaches up for 404 feet and dominates the entire skyline for miles around.
Still on the subject of drama, on BBC2 shortly, there's part 2 of the 5-part story set in the Wiltshire village of Bishop in the year 1820, Bread or Blood. Here on BBC1 in 35 minutes, Europe Inside Out looks at Turkey. First, Colin Morris is in conversation with Dame Flora Robson and Marius Goring in the last of the present series of Friends.
As a 15-year-old schoolboy, Marius Goring admired Flora Robson from afar when he first saw her on the stage in 1929. The play, 6 Characters in Search of an Author, proved a turning point in both their lives. Marius Goring decided once and for all to become an actor. Flora Robson was hailed as a great success after nearly giving up acting altogether. Now in her 80th year, Dame Flora perhaps proves that great actors are born, not made. After only 1 year out of drama school, she had a job at the prestigious Oxford Playhouse, and it looked as if her career was launched. But she was sacked because her face literally didn't fit. She wasn't considered beautiful enough to be a leading lady, nor was she old enough to play character roles. The break nearly put her out of acting for good. At 23, she was convinced she was a failure. Times were hard, so she took a job as a welfare officer in the shredded wheat factory near her home in Welwyn Garden City. Factory work was a revelation. For the first time, she was able to see another kind of working life outside the rarefied atmosphere of the theatre. She also had a sharp eye for the way people behaved, upon which she was able to draw a great deal later on. After 4 years in the factory, her deliverance came. Her old friend from Oxford, Tyrone Guthrie, got her a job with the Cambridge Festival Theatre. The critics singled her out for praise, and from then on, stardom was inevitable. In the 1930s, she joined the Old Vic. She toured America in the 40s and worked in Hollywood. Later came television and more starring roles in the West End. From the 1930s onwards, she never stopped working. And though she's officially retired, her 50th film comes out this year. In 1934, when Dame Flora's reputation at the Old Vic was growing, she was cast as Mary Tudor, and a search was on for an actor to play Philip of Spain. The eventual choice was Marius Goring, then a successful young actor, fresh from his first West End lead. Marius was born in 1912. His father was a doctor who died in the flu epidemic of 1918. His mother struggled to give her 2 boys a good education, and Marius eventually won a scholarship to Cambridge. But his only love was acting, and he chose instead to go abroad and to study languages, leaving himself more time for working in the theatre. When he was 20, he was an assistant stage manager at the Old Vic, while Flora Robson was in the company starring with Charles Laughton. Their paths hardly crossed, until 18 months later, the young actor heard that he'd been cast opposite Flora in Mary Tudor. Despite initial misgivings, the casting worked, and they became friends. They played together again several times just before the war, and their friendship was firmly sealed. During the war, Marius went into the army and later worked for the German service of the BBC. When he picked up his acting career again, he became for a time a kind of actor-manager and producer, touring a good deal abroad, as well as making regular appearances in the West End and in films and television, where perhaps his best-known role was as a forensic scientist in The Expert. The gypsy life of actors makes it hard to keep friendships in repair, but they often claim that there is a special intensity in an acting partnership which cements a friendship for good. The young schoolboy not only met the actress he admired so much, he shared a part of her career and made a lifelong friend.
Dame Flora, there's a kind of cliché of the fiction plot about the great star who's adored publicly by millions but privately feels very alone and starved of love. Do you have any sense that that's been your life?
Oh, yes, very much so. One, because it started so early. My father said, "You're going on the stage," when I was 5 after appearing at a school concert. And ever since then, I've had to give up. Other people would go out and play, to the haymaking. I had to stay at home for a lesson. And when I used to go to parties, I think because all my ancestors were sailors, I want to travel the world, and I have traveled.
On BBC2 shortly, international pro-celebrity golf teams Fred Truman with Lee Trevino and Jimmy Hill with Fuzzy Zeller over 9 holes on the King's Course at Gleneagles in Scotland. Here on BBC1 in 25 minutes, Scotland's popular duo the Corries in a 21st anniversary concert. First, we take the Turkish gamble with Europe Inside Out.
If you had a dream of the exotic East, it might look much like this.